stage voice. It's not a problem. Testing, 1, 2. Okay. Is this working?
Yes.
Thank you all for coming out to the Viewpoints on Science and Religion panel discussion. I would just like to take a moment to thank everyone that has participated in getting this thing together. Dan Ledford for contacting most of our speakers. Freethinkers at Virginia Tech for actually doing the hosting and reservation of rooms. I'd also like to thank CREW, the Christian Scholars Network, and the Tri-Cities Area Non-Theist Group for advertising and funding assistance. And of course our panelists. And we're going to just kind of start off, this is going to be kind of a conversational event. We're going to start off with the panelists reading a brief personal statement about their viewpoints in science and religion. And then we'll have a discussion for about 30 minutes and then open the floor up for questions from you, the audience. We'll just go ahead and start. First we have Professor Nahum Marov from the physics department. Do you want to go here or there? You've got a stool for you. That's really nice and comfy.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be invited for this event, and I want to thank Zach and everyone who worked on organizing this. And I hope the audience will gain some from this event, be entertained, amused, shake their heads, whatever is appropriate. So, as Zach said, I'm a professor in the physics department. I believe I'm the only non-native US citizen here from the panelists. So let me just give you a little bit brief of my history and upbringing and how it's connected to all this. I was born and raised in Israel, and my family is of Jewish faith. My household was rather secular. We used to celebrate the holidays, and I still do. I really like all of the traditions in the Jewish faith. We have a very kind of relaxed attitude about religious belief where I grew up. And I more or less knew that I am a scientist ever since I knew how to think. So at about the age of 5 or 6, when people were start landing on the moon, it was probably the most formative event in my life. And people told me, oh, so you want to be an astronaut, you want to land on the moon? I said, no, I want the astronauts to bring me stuff and I'll tell them what it means. Okay? So, from very early age, I knew I wanted to be a scientist, and I continued that journey. And I must say that that brought me a lot of satisfaction and very deep connection to everything around me. I arrived to the US about 24 years ago. Did my PhD in astrophysics in Colorado, spent a lot of time in the West, and 5.5 years ago came here as a professor of physics. So that is more or less my background. The interconnection or the relationship between science and religion always fascinated me since I was a very early age. I consider myself to be a very kind of an evidence-based person. It's very difficult to convince me with anything that does not have hard evidence for it. And as far as my religion beliefs, I'll say I'm probably agnostic. I can see around me in society on small and large cases the impact of religion. And some of the things that religion is very dear to my heart is my mother-in-law. Is living in Colorado, and she is one of the very few lawyers that actually does good. What do I mean by that? She is an advocate for foster kids. These lawyers are paid by the state. They paid very poorly, and she does it with a mission. And as she told me personally, she does it because of her Christian convictions. And so I definitely respect the fact that religious beliefs can have a very profound and good influence on people's actions. But here we are to discuss the issues that are related to science and religion, so I want to give you a few more observations and a little bit of my personal worldview. From the point of view that we have now, my worldview is that we by now had pieced up together very well two things. In the last 400 years, the emergence of science had given us an actual understanding of how the natural world works, which is amazing. We didn't have anything like that beforehand. We thought that diseases are inflicted on us by the gods, volcanoes and earthquakes are because we had sinned or anything like that. And in the past 400 years, we have built probably the most impressive intellectual structure in human history, which is the scientific understanding of the world and everything that comes with that. The technology that I'm speaking to you right now was not available 400 years. 400 years ago, more than half of my audience would have died by the age of 5 from all kinds of trivial diseases that now, because of science and technology, can cure. So science is an extremely powerful agent in society and probably defined the past 400 years. As a worldview, it has a lot of strength and a lot of prominence because of what it brought us to, because it really had improved our lives and it is the main force in advancing society as we know it. So I'm looking at that and I'm asking myself, what have we seen of the past in our history, and how does things look like from our point of view? From the vantage of very early age, we now know much better about how religion started and what happened in ancient history. And we know, for example, that all religion had copied a lot from each other. We know that most of the moral laws that are so precious to many of the people in this audience were known thousands of years before, Hammurabi law code and other things like that. We know that a lot of the stories were rehashed or retold. The ancient Egyptians, for example, 1,000 years before the Bible was written, had a beautiful story about the parting of the Nile to get a beautiful emerald that was dumped into by a beautiful maiden that the Pharaoh wanted to impress. So he's done that. What I'm trying to say is that I can understand a lot how people relate to religion. I have very little connection to that in my own worldview because I believe that most of these issues stem from people holding views that were formed more than 2,000 years ago. In an era that was very superstitious, very dark, where we didn't know anything about the world, and holding these views today are, especially when it comes to scientific issues, is very problematic. And I want to mention 2 or 3 small examples. The first example, which is a hot point in the US, is the whole issue of creationism versus evolution. And it always surprised me that the debate is so narrow in the US. As I see it, most of Christian faith in the world actually accept Darwinian evolution fully. And by that I mean, for example, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has a very enlightened message signed by Ratzinger just before he became Pope, which said that the Catholic Church doesn't have any quarrel with the scientific finding of the world, that the world was formed 13.7 billion years ago in the Big Bang, that the Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago. It says correctly that no one, science does not know how life was formed, which is a very correct statement. And after life was formed on Earth, it's evolved according to Darwinian evolution, and it does not have any issue with that. Same thing is with other Christian denominations. So what surprised me always is that the debate in the US is cast as science versus religion, when what it really is actually an inner debate in religious circles. The majority of Christians in the world, especially their leaders, accept the finding of science. And there is a strong minority in the US that does not and want to cast it as a debate between science and religion. I would also say that I have, one of the major puzzles that I always have is, the fact that there are so many religions in the world. And in normal discourse, especially in our society, it is not really permitted to discuss the fact that almost all of them are mutually exclusive. We have 2,000 religions on earth. Many of them believe in a God or the God, and they are in a constant state of battling and fighting with each other. One of my friends always say, if all of them believe in the same God, couldn't that God once and for all come to all of our heads and tell us, look, I'm Jehovah, and I'm the God you should believe in, and that's the end of that. Or if you want better than that, you can write a text across the moon. God can come, God has infinite powers, and just write, I am God, this is what's happening, and stop all these divisions, stop all this religious fighting among yourself, and stop the fact that the only main reason that people are such strong adherent to religion is because they were indoctrinated to it from a very early age. Many people here, if they would have born in Iraq, in Baghdad, instead of being born in Southwest Virginia, would have been a very strong religious Muslims, probably rather fanatics. If the religious beliefs are so dependent on geography and what you have, then I personally have a significant problem with following any of the advice or any of the religious suggestions about moral values or behavior or things like that. I will stop here and leave room for my colleagues and for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Next we have Professor Carlier from chemistry.
Okay, well, thank you, Zach, for giving me a chance to be here tonight. And as was mentioned, I'm a professor of chemistry, and my particular area is organic chemistry, specifically organic synthesis that's making new molecules out of other molecules, and its applications to medicine and public health. And I just love chemistry, and again, like Nahum, I was a precocious lad, and I had a basement lab, and I used to go with my mom to buy sulfuric acid. Before 9/11, 12-year-old kid. This could never happen now. So I love chemistry, and what do I love about it? I love the fact that chemistry is an experimental science. I can develop a hypothesis. I can design an experiment to test the hypothesis. We do the experiment. We evaluate the data. Does the data support the hypothesis or not? And then we think of another experiment. And it's great. And when my students get a great result in the lab, I tell them, do it again. The wonderful thing about chemistry and experimental science in general is that it's reproducible. So one last thing I like about chemistry, as I said, I'm sort of interested in medicine, and I just love the fact that I can draw a representation of a molecule with letters and lines. This is crazy. But this works. And I can devise a synthesis for a molecule that could maybe help somebody. So that's what I love about chemistry. I'm one of the theists on the panel tonight. I'm a Christian, and I think this is a really important event, and I thank the Freethinkers for organizing it. It's terrific. And when Zach described for me his vision for the night, I thought, wow, this is perfect. I totally agree with this, because I think a lot of us, and I'm speaking to the students here, we come to university and we haven't really evaluated our religious beliefs or our lack of religious beliefs. And university is a great place to do that. As faculty and students, our job here is to think and to question. And it's fantastic that you're here. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from all my colleagues on this subject. So I was raised in a church-going family. And when I was in high school, I began to struggle with the issue, is Christianity really true? And we've heard this, that when you really get down to the nitty-gritty, the religions don't really agree. And I agree with that. And it was clear to me as a high school student that Christianity was more than morality. Christianity made historical claims. Christianity made theological claims. And the theological claims of Christianity are grounded in historical claims. And the big one is the resurrection of Jesus. And, we're a week away from Easter. What a great time to talk about this. This is an important question. Did Jesus rise from the dead? If he didn't, Christianity is false. It's a lie, and it should be discarded. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, then that changes everything. And that fact should influence my every decision and all my vision of what's important in life. So, we've been talking about, is there a conflict between Christianity and science? And I would say there is no necessary conflict. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, because we've talked about how there is conflict. And the question is, does there need to be? And I don't think there is a necessary conflict. As a Christian, when I do science, as I teach chemistry, as I do research, I am just filled with awe and marvel at the order and beauty and intricacy of matter at the molecular level. That's what I see. And so when I read in the Psalms that the heavens are telling the glory of God, the skies declare his handiwork, that is exactly my emotion as I learn something new in chemistry or biochemistry. It's fantastic. A few examples. Enzymes, they're amazing catalytic power. DNA replication and the transcription translation of machinery. It's really incredible. So as I said, the beauty of what I see really inspires me and points me to the beauty of an incredible creator. Now, as we've talked already today, I think a lot of people believe that it's the gaps in our understanding that drive people to religion. There's a name for that. It's called the God of the Gaps. And I don't really look at it that way. Of course, when we're doing science, we find gaps in our understanding. But for me, it's not those gaps that really point me to God. It's the things that I do understand that point me to God. It's quite incredible. All right, so where's the conflict? How are we doing on time? Okay. Where is the conflict? There's no necessary conflict between theism and science. There's no necessary conflict. Where's the conflict? It's between metaphysical naturalism and theism. So for those of you that are not familiar with this term, metaphysical naturalism is the belief that all there is matter and energy. You could say that all that matters is matter. That's a shorthand. So the question is metaphysical naturalism required for science? And I think the answer is clearly no. If we review this marvelous 400-year history of science, which I agree is quite amazing, and we review the major players, of course you'll find agnostics and you'll find atheists, but you'll find a lot of theists, and you'll find a lot of Christians. And if we were to review the most eminent living scientists today, you would find lots and lots of theists and lots of Christians. So from that basis, there doesn't seem to be a necessary conflict. Let's talk about what science requires. Science does operate on assumptions. We can list a few of them. One of the very first is that nature is intelligible and is not capricious. A second assumption is that our mind and our senses give us reliable information about the universe around us. Another assumption is that mathematics and language can be used usefully to describe the world around us. What are the other assumptions? That rational thought and knowledge are possible. One last one, the uniformity of the universe is quite stunning. And the uniformity of the universe is the means by which we use inductive inference. We look at the way things happen in the past, and then we can predict what will happen in the future. Okay, so these are required for science. Metaphysical naturalism is not a requirement of science. We can begin to ask, which philosophical framework best supports the scientific endeavor? metaphysical naturalism or theism. Obviously, I'm a theist, so I'm leaning towards the theism side. So let's take the uniformity of nature. From a completely materialistic standpoint, what reason do we have to believe that nature is uniform? If we operate from a complete naturalistic standpoint, and we have a very reductionist view of human thought processes, we have to ask, our deepest convictions, the ones we hold most dear to us, if they are simply the product, the byproduct of time and matter and chance, if our thoughts are merely the consequence of random collisions of molecules, then what reason do we have to trust our rationality? If we take the theist perspective, then we believe the universe was created by an orderly God, and that God created man in his image. And so, God being an orderly God would create an orderly universe, and that provides a foundation for our belief in the uniformity of nature. If we're created in the image of a rational God, then that gives us some foundation for our rational thought. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here. Science is fantastic, and I hope I've convinced you that I love it. And over the last 100 years in particular, we've made amazing advances. But in some sense, science has been so successful, it's shown us its own limitations. We know that the universe was created 13.7 or 13.8 billion years ago from nothing. So in science, we can go back to just a few instants before that Big Bang, and then we can't go any further. So metaphysical naturalism, as we go back, it sort of disappears in a puff with the universe at the Big Bang. Another feature of the universe that's quite well agreed upon is the amazing fine-tuning of all the physical constants of the universe. How do we explain that? It's really a puzzle, and it's caused great consternation for many non-theist scientists. How do we explain this? And one of the best answers that I've heard from non-theists is, it just is. But from a theist perspective, we believe that God created the universe, so Big Bang, wonderful, works. We believe that God created the universe in a way that could support life. So the fine-tuning argument makes total sense. Thank you very much for your attention.
Next we have Professor Goodrum from the Department of Science and Technology and Society. And real quick, just because the numbers have been mentioned twice so far, the new Planck data is out, and it's 13.81 billion is
I'm gratified to see so many people here today for a topic that is not only an interesting topic, but actually a very important topic. It's been an important topic for a very long time. I'm a non-scientist on this panel. I'm actually a historian of science. And as a young boy, so since my previous speakers have addressed their childhood, childhoods are in fact where we acquire our interests and often a lot of the attitudes that we carry through the rest of our careers. As a young person, so I was raised in New England in a sort of Methodist family, but that was a rather secular family. And as a individual, as a boy, I was extremely interested in nature, extremely interested in science. So science was sort of my first love. But I was also interested in a lot of other things. In fact, I was interested in a lot of things that dealt with the humanities. And in fact, as I was going to university, one of the struggles I had was, well, what in the world am I actually going to study? All these things I'm interested in, how can I find something that brings together all these different things that I'm interested in? And one of the things that I found as a solution is, in fact, one of the things that still informs much of what I do now. I realized that, anthropology would be a great field to study because I'm interested in science, and anthropology is a science, but anthropology is a science that studies human beings. And since I'm also interested in human culture, and I'm interested in history, and in religion, and how cultures work, well, anthropology would be this great field. And in fact, it's my background as an anthropologist that got me interested in this basic question of what is the relationship in any culture of their understanding of nature, but also their understanding of supernatural forces. So what is the relationship between science and religion? And it was as an undergraduate that I actually discovered that there was such a thing as the history of science that one could study. And so I went to graduate school at Indiana University, studied the history of science, took courses in science and religion, and I came to Tech 10 years ago. For the past 10 years, I've been teaching a course on science and religion. And it's been a great joy to talk to students who come to my class, who are scientists. Some of them are believers. Some of them have very set views on what the relationship between science and religion should be. Some of them are clearly struggling with how can I be a scientist and be religious too. And in my own research, my primary interests are in the history of the human sciences, and specifically sort of prehistoric archaeology, human evolution, paleoanthropology, sciences where fundamental questions about where did human beings come from and what is the best way to account for human beings. It is never just a scientific question. It has always been fundamentally a religious question too. So for a long time now, I've been wrestling with questions of science and religion. And to some extent, as a historian, one of the benefits that I have is, unlike philosophers, theologians, sociologists, I'm not only confronting the question of what should be the proper relationship between science and religion, I can actually do empirical studies, as scientists do, on, well, what has actually been the relationship between science and religion over this past 400-year period since the scientific revolution. And in fact, one could push that back much further, all the way back to the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Chinese, and the Indians, with the birth of civilization and the birth of the rational investigation of nature on the one hand, but also these accepted theological traditions on the other, where the history of the interaction of science and religion is not a simple one. And one of the difficulties, I think, in the modern world, and especially in America, is that the relationship between science and religion has often been represented as one of conflict. And not only that the relationship has been a relationship of conflict, but that it is necessarily so. And that is actually factually wrong. So as a historian, I can actually say, if you go back to the great generation of Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and Newton, and trace that generation forward to the modern era, the relationship between science and religion has been a complex one. Many scientists in the past were explicitly influenced by their religious views. They saw the reconciliation of their science and their religion as of fundamental importance to them, while at the same time they were confronted with peers and colleagues who shared very different views, who in fact did view the world from a sort of materialist perspective, from an atheistic perspective, from a naturalistic perspective. One noteworthy trend, however, is that if you look at this relationship between science and religion from the Renaissance until now, one of the things that most scientists and most intellectuals were increasingly aware of as you move from the 17th century into the 18th into the 19th, while in previous eras there were far more scientists who believed in God, far more scientists who, in the Christian tradition at least, accepted sort of the biblical view of the world and felt that their science had to be reconciled with that biblical view of the world, oftentimes where that meant, you might actually have to modify your interpretation of Scripture to be able to accept some modern science. By the 19th century, it was becoming quite clear that, yes, in fact, a lot of modern scientific discoveries, the age of the Earth in geology, the evolution of species in biology, new theories in astronomy for the birth of the cosmos, in fact, the very theory of matter in physics, which made it more and more difficult to comprehend the existence of something like an immaterial soul. Science was, in fact, for many, clearly presenting new ideas about the world that were very difficult to reconcile, not only with metaphorical interpretations of Scripture, but much more problematically for many, certainly problematic for literal readings of Scripture. So the very history of science itself in the modern world, a lot of science has been done. And one of the main things that makes this a serious problem is very few of us want to give up our modern science And especially because in the American context, it is modern science that gives us all of our wonderful new technological gadgets and, of course, modern medical solutions to disease. We don't want to give up our science, and yet we still in the modern world, in a very large part, are a culture and a society who do not want to give up our religion. The problem in the modern world for many still is, how do we adopt modern science and still find a way to be religious in an increasingly scientific view of the world? This is a problem that's been a problem in the West for some time. It's a problem that is just now becoming a more serious problem in other parts of the world, where in Muslim countries, as they modernize and Western science become a more dominant force there, they are confronted with this question. In Chinese society, in Indian society, one of the things that Western scholars are also guilty of, they too often view the problem of science and religion, or the historical question of the relationship between science and religion, as really the relationship between science and Christianity or Judaism. A much more global perspective is actually not only interesting from a scholarly perspective, but also a more global perspective is going to be important, as more and more scientists of the world are actually non-Christians, non-Western, where their religious traditions are being challenged too. And the ways in which non-Western cultures solve the problem of how do you remain Muslim, Hindu, Confucian, and adopt modern science as well, is going to have profound implications for the kind of science that gets done and the kind of world that we're going to be able to live in. So I'm glad that we're talking about this topic, because it is a topic that is alive and well, and the ways in which we answer these questions really are going to have impacts on the kinds of research that scientists are going to be allowed to do, stem cell research, cloning, but it's also going to have a profound impact on how we think of the world and how we think of ourselves. Thank you.
And finally, we have Professor Tyson from the biology department.
Good evening. My name is John Tyson, and I'm a professor of molecular systems biology at Virginia Tech. And it's a great pleasure to be here with my distinguished colleagues to talk about these really interesting and important questions. And I too want to thank the Freethinkers Club and crew and the Christian Scholars Network and TANG for hosting this event. I should also say from the outset that the opinions I present are solely my own, and they're not a reflection of Virginia Tech or the Department of Biology, or any church for that matter. And I guess I should also start off with a boyhood story, since everybody else did. I grew up in a Christian home. I went to Christian school. I was always very interested in science, and whenever I asked scientific questions, people around me tend to be very uncomfortable and give a kind of religious answer. And after a while, I just stopped asking them those questions, because it was clear that it wasn't really important to them. There were other things much more important. But I was the kind of kid who loved to take things apart and then try and put them back together again. And how does it work? And got fascinated by chemistry and then by biology. That was kind of my trajectory. So both science and religion have always been extremely important to me as a human being and as a scholar. And I think I want to address, I should also say, I'm a theoretician. I build mathematical models and do computations and things like that. I'm not a wet hands guy in the laboratory doing experiments. So I think maybe my comments here are also going to be a little bit more theoretical about the relationship between science and religion. Some points have already been made by my colleagues. The question on the flyer that advertised this event, can we study science and maintain our faith? Well, the answer is clearly yes, because as people have pointed out, over 400 years that we've practiced science, many scientists have been Christians and theists, and many have been agnostics and atheists. Apparently, science isn't particularly correlated with your religious points of view. And now, Western science is spread all over the world. It's practiced in every nation by people of every race and creed and religious conviction. And many people many scientists, good scientists, are religious have religious convictions and many don't. So the real question is, I think, what's the relationship between scientific inquiry and religious convictions? And as we know what science is all about. Science is about careful observations and controlled experiments and reproducibility. Science is also about theoretical constructs that draw together these experimental facts into some sort of a coherent understanding of nature and how nature works. Also, the scientific method is strictly naturalistic. Our attempts to explain things scientifically have to be based on natural objects, forces, and interactions. And no supernatural agencies are permitted in the scientific investigation of the rule. I think that's just one of the facts, that's just one of the rules of the game. It's called methodological naturalism. So when you practice science in the lab or in the office, it's just against the rules to bring in God as an explanatory feature of the natural world. But this methodological naturalism does not imply an all-encompassing philosophical naturalism as an explanation of the world and our place in the world. I think that this naturalistic methodology of science kind of rules out many questions that we find important, that science can address. Questions like what is love, what is beauty, what is justice? Science just can't really tell us very much about that. For that we need different methodologies. Throughout human history, men and women have sought answers to these deeply personal questions in art and music and poetry, in storytelling, in sacred texts, in prayer and in worship. These non-scientific methods provide us with narratives for understanding the moral and spiritual and human dimensions of our lives. They provide answers to questions that science cannot address. Where does love come from? Why do we clamor for justice? How do we know what is right? Why do we fail to live up to our expectations? For the purpose of this discussion tonight, there seem to be two basic narratives at play: philosophical naturalism and theism. These worldviews, I think, are beyond scientific proof or disproof. Take, for example, Carl Sagan's famous pronouncement, "The cosmos is all there is, all there was, all there ever will be." Sagan's claim is a philosophical worldview, not a statement of scientific fact. The theist would say, along with Genesis 1:1, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Both of these narratives are consistent with the Big Bang cosmology, with the second law of thermodynamics, and with the evolutionary continuity of life. Neither of them can be proved or disproved by some ingenious experiment. At some point, each of us must choose which of these narratives or some other alternative to base our life on. Why am I uncomfortable with an all-encompassing philosophical naturalism? I'm convinced that there are real things that exist outside the natural physical world of atoms, molecules, and force fields. Consider the statement, "I love my wife and children and I would never betray them." What does that mean? Is it just a statement about my hormones or my upbringing or neural activity in my frontal lobes? We know that these physical factors play roles in our mental attitudes, but we also believe, or at least we live as if they express something true and meaningful about human relationships. We all have a set of beliefs that seek to make sense of the spiritual, moral, and personal aspects of our existence. Whether these are religious beliefs or not, we all live by a non-scientific narrative. If science somehow discredits religion, then it also discredits all of these other non-scientific narratives. Because our worldview has profound influences on how we live, we all, by default or by considered choice, make a commitment to one narrative or another. The choice is not based on science because science by its very nature refuses to comment on these issues. We must rely on other ways of knowing and deciding, and that is where I believe religious and humanistic convictions come into play in each of our lives. Thank you.
Now we're going to move on to a discussion portion of the event. Can you all hear me? Now we're going to move on to the discussion portion of the event. It's not worth it. What we'd like this discussion to be is a template, especially for students, on how to approach personal questions about worldviews and how we can discuss those with our colleagues, with our friends, in a polite and civil manner. And so I know we're going to have a nice discussion here. That's going to be very polite and civil. But here's my threat. I'll talk into that microphone to moderate, and we'll let the reverb just silence everyone. Does anyone have any questions for each other? I'll give preference to I'll do it alphabetically. Okay.
Well, can you hear me today? Okay. Try and imitate my rock star stand here. So I want to ask a very simple question in order to kind of even the state of the debate. And it is not a real question, it is an observation that I had for a long time, and I would like to hear mainly my theist friend to see their opinion about that. But it is something that I noticed that in our society and other society, people are really not aware of. And my observation is very simple. All the sacred books that we have, and obviously the theists on our panels are Christians, but we have the Bible, we have the Quran, we have the Bhagavad Gita, we have lots of sacred texts for different people that were written at least 1,500 years ago or more, unless you take the Book of Mormon that was written 150 years ago. But let's take the ancient texts that were written before the scientific revolution. As far as just the understanding of the natural world, I would say something very simple that I find surprisingly most people are not aware of, and that is none of these texts have a single fact about the natural world that was not known to the primitive culture that written it. And I think this is a very profound statement because for me as an evidence-based person, if a text that I'm supposed to revere as having some deity wisdom to it, have some godly intelligence in it, if it doesn't tell me anything of the millions of new facts that we learned, for me it's very problematic to take this text seriously to guide me in anything else in life. And I'll give you just two very simple examples how what is not in the text that is important to me. In first chapter in Genesis, when God created everything, he could have said, I created the planet Saturn, which all the ancient people knew, and I gave it magnificent rings. Okay? That would be profound, because no one on Earth have known that, yet the planet has that. And many things like that. So I would like to ask my theist colleagues mainly, do they agree that all of these ancient texts do not have a single fact about nature that was not known before, and does it have any implication to how they relate to these texts?
So, Dr. Carlier, Dr. Tyson,
Okay, so let me just try to summarize. So the question is, and I'll have to just speak about the Bible because that's the ancient text I know best. So why does the Bible not contain any scientific insight that would sort of be evidence of its supernatural provenance that would say this is something that no one could have known at that time and that later on we would have found out? Is that right? Okay, so I'm trying to decide how to go with this question. I'll just start with Genesis 1. As far as I understand, the ancient Greek philosophers thought the universe was eternal. And the idea of a created universe, of a universe that sprang into existence, is pretty new. I think it was Georges Lemaitre. I don't remember the first name. He's a physicist and a priest. Right, and so he was the one who came up with the Big Bang, and that whole idea was discredited, was it not? Fred Hoyle fought it tooth and nail. Okay, so it wasn't until we got a lot of confirmatory evidence. So I would say the idea that the universe did not exist eternally would be an example of something that is in Genesis, in the very first chapter of Genesis, that the ancient world could not have known. And now modern science says is the best explanation.
But there's lots of creation myth. Lots of creation myth of many, many cultures that have created the world, that the world is not eternal. So on the whole, it's just one of many, many different creation myth stories like that.
Okay, but would that be an example of something that people could not have known at the time and that subsequently science showed was true?
Dr. Tice's
Yeah, I'll just try to address the question. It's a very good question. And I think giving us scientific knowledge about the world is not really the purpose of these sacred texts. I think God gave us minds and hands and eyes to investigate the world and figure this stuff out for ourselves. I think that's one of the great joys of science for us who practice it. What we really needed to hear from God was not about how the world works, but how we work, our relationship to God, and where sin comes from, where redemption comes from, why we're in rebellion against the Creator. These are the grand issues that are addressed, at least in the Bible, in the very first chapter, and presumably also in the other religious books of the world.
And I actually have two comments that I'd like to make with this. One being, in the Middle Ages and all the way, so from about the year 500 all the way until about 1500s, the vast majority of intellectuals did in fact believe that the Bible was a source of information about the natural world. So it was not thought that it was merely a sort of moral code or a theological text. The vast majority of intellectuals and educated people really did in fact go to, especially Genesis, for information about it, how nature works, what is actually real in the world. My second comment addresses this question of the origins of the world and how religions have addressed this. Anthropology is the place that one should really go to this. I mean, anthropologists for a very long time have been collecting information about cross-culturally people's ideas about the origins of the world, from ancient civilizations to quite simple tribal societies. Very complex mythologies have been constructed that address this question of the origins of the world. It's apparent that human beings, by nature, are interested in this question of the origins of the world, and using reason and experience of the world, we're quite willing to construct explanations for the origins of the world. They resorted to gods, I think most likely because they couldn't imagine any force in the world being capable of creating the world. But it is certainly not the case that the biblical account of creation is in some way unique. In fact, those who study comparative mythology and compare the traditions of other cultures with the ancient Hebrew tradition, what's astonishing, in fact, is not how different it is. What is astonishing is how similar it is.
I just have a question for Matthew. Isn't Genesis account rather unique in its monotheistic take on the creation? All the other creation myths I know of are these warring gods slashing each other and creating the earth out of the entrails of their enemies and things like that.
That's exactly right. And so, what I would say, my scholarly comment to this would be, sociologists, in fact, are quite interested in what is unique about this. Perhaps is not the content of what Genesis says. What is unique about this is the uniqueness of monotheism. And so if one looks at sort of the history of monotheism, it appears only a very few times. So we know in ancient Egypt there's an attempt at this, which actually doesn't go so well. In India, there is a successful attempt at sort of a monotheism within sort of the philosophical Hindu universe. And so what is interesting about ancient Jews then, and I would say theologically, but also sociologically, what led them to this innovative idea, but they were not the only people to come to this idea. It's unusual in traditions, but it is not unique. And so what becomes interesting then is, can we look at what's the generation that probably formulated Genesis, and what similarities and differences do they have of other cultures who did come to monotheism and try to construct a monotheistic account of the world?
I would say, not being an anthropologist, you study things as a sort of religion as a human construct. Is that fair to say?
I would say that methodologically, most anthropologists think that the best way to approach anthropology, just as chemists and physicists and biologists think that the best way to approach other things in nature is to presume that their origin is from the human beings, and that they fulfill human purpose.
Right. So another viewpoint is that if there were a transcendent creator God, he could somehow interact with his creation.
That's right.
And reveal himself to them.
That's right.
And that could account for the rise of monotheism.
That's right.
Okay, next leading question, we'll go to Professor Carle. Do you have any?
Let's see, I was taking furious notes. Let's see. Yeah, you said something I found really interesting, and something I hear a lot. You know, if there were a God, why doesn't he communicate himself to us in a sort of unambiguous way? Is that? So I thought maybe we could have some discussion on that.
Well, I think this is an excellent question, and the angle that I want to show here is slightly the broader sense of the scientific worldview. And it's again something that I notice a lot because I'm a scientist going to scientific conferences. In the modern world, we have a very interesting phenomenon. I can easily converse with scientists that come from Iran, from China, from Japan, from India, from Sri Lanka, when it becomes to the scientific discipline. Because we all agreed on the ground rules, and we all agreed not to take any dogma that was written in ancient times as something that is, we have to uphold sacred, whether or not there is any evidence for. And therefore we can have a productive, intelligent, and civil discussion on these issues. So I have Chinese students now, I talk with Chinese scholars, we discuss astrophysics, what's happening with supermassive black holes, and things like that. This is total contrast with the general way that religions are on the earth. People in this culture put a lot of significance to the resurrection, to the story of the flood in the Bible, but Chinese people just laugh at them as nonsensical stories, and vice versa. As we heard here, some of the mythological creation stories that are very dear to people have gods that shed entrails and all kinds of things like that. So we don't take them seriously. There is a beautiful unifying things to modern science, philosophically, and dare I say spiritually, by the ability of all people in the world to connect, by the ability of us to agree on several very simple points of view, and to basically say, we do not accept any dogma, we do not give any sacrism, if that is a word, for any text that was written before. We are solely driven by evidence, we are solely, and basically if we find something that disproves our cherished held beliefs or point of view, what we do is we don't discard the evidence, we discard the point of view. So that is kind of a meta relationship between science and religion in the modern world. It fascinates me a lot.
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how I want to come back to that. I really do appreciate what you say about the civil nature of scientific discourse. That is almost always the case. I have been at conferences where people are ready to punch each other. Okay, so I think that we are very possessive of our hypotheses, and Unfortunately, most of the time we do come around and we agree that, okay, I have to release this hypothesis. So as I was very clear, I believe that Christianity is based on historical claims, so I have to be in the same position as well. If someone could prove that Jesus did not rise from the dead, then that would be a very serious matter. But I think, more to your point, I think science is a fantastic subject, but I think it's really great, but it leaves out almost all the really important stuff. If you like, why are we here? What makes humans special? What is love? Why should there be justice in the world? Why is it wrong to torture babies? These are very emotional issues, and probably that is the reason why we get so engaged. And so it's hard to talk about these things civilly, and I think we're doing a good job of it tonight.
On that view, Professor Tessman's moving to the mic, so.
Yeah, I was just going to make the same point that Paul made, that as long as we're talking about rather boring scientific issues, it's easy to keep our cool and have a civil discussion. But there are, as I said in my opening remarks, there are many, many questions that we really need to address as human beings about how society should be organized, how our laws should be written, how we should treat foreigners and immigrants and things like that. And science really can't address these issues. We have to have other ways of talking and thinking, and they raise high emotions. So I don't think it's particularly an issue about religion. It's just about being a human being in a diverse society with difficult problems that have to be addressed. Science is really easy, I find. That's why I stay in my office and do it, because it's time to get trouble.
Science is easy, but people who really pay attention to new philosophical discoveries, new scientific discoveries and new scientific theories that have philosophical implications, the philosophical implications are not easy. And that's often what really gets people heated, and where theologians who are paying attention, philosophers who are paying attention, and those scientists who care about philosophical issues, this is where things become a big deal. Because if you are created in the image of God, or if you evolved from an ape, the reason why we do argue about this is because people who think about the full implications of this, there are significant implications of what idea that you adopt. So yes, a lot of science is uncontroversial, and the scientists can do their work without being too concerned about, is this going to generate huge debate? What make great scientific theories and great scientific discoveries great is that they do actually fundamentally challenge not just a scientific view of the world, but our philosophical understanding of the world and ourselves.
Yeah, you've opened up a big issue here about evolution and the Genesis account, and I guess I should address that at this point. I don't have a problem with the notion that human beings are evolved from hominid ancestors, and that our closest relatives are the great apes, and the notion in Genesis chapter 1 that human beings are created in the image of God. Both of those seem to be true to me, true to my experience and true to my science. So it causes a lot of consternation for other people, to be sure, and from some of my theologian friends and some of my brothers, but not for me. I believe in a natural world. God created a natural world. He set laws in motion, and it's pretty clear that the way life evolved on Earth was pretty much the way it's described in the biology textbooks. In the same way that it's the law of gravitation that holds the solar system together. And yet, we can also say true things about God as the creator and the sustainer of the universe. They're kind of parallel, alternative explanations, and we don't have to choose between one or the other. They can both be true. And with many examples in everyday life where we have two parallel explanations, a scientific explanation of why the water is boiling on the stove, and a completely humanistic explanation of the fact that, I plan to make a cup of tea. They're both true explanations of the same phenomenon. There's no inconsistency or no problem, I think.
No, I completely agree. You would agree that there has to be some compatibility between both of them.
There has to be, for sure.
Let's see. Do Professor Goodrum or Tyson have any pressing lead questions, or do you want to?
I think we should open it up to the
Q&A.
audience.
Okay. All right. Let's thank the panelists again for their. We're gonna now open the floor to questions from the audience. We have 2 mics down here on the floor. If you'd just like to come up and ask a question, I would ask that you focus your question either to a panelist in particular or the panel, and please make sure to actually ask a question. I'd love to hear your viewpoint afterwards if you would just like to state it. And we have the room until 8, but we'll be stopping questions here in about 20 minutes. So if anyone would like to ask a question, come down to one of the microphones. They're freely available.
All right, my question's for Dr. Tyson. In your opening statement, you mentioned that certain aspects are beyond science, like love and justice, and then later on, why not to eat small children. And my question is, why are those aspects beyond science? Don't we currently use sociology, psychology, and biology to study love and justice?
Okay, that's a very good question. I'll try to be brief. I believe that we, as human beings, are evolved from animal forebears, and that we have kind of inherited many of the sociological and psychological traits that we can see in other organisms. And that's the sort of thing, at least that biologists study, sociobiologists. And they talk about the evolutionary origins of animal societies, and much of that can be extrapolated to human societies. But nonetheless, I'm completely convinced that human social organization, human understanding of moral responsibility and sense of justice, and our storytelling, the narratives, there's nothing that's completely unique, I think, in the created world. And I just don't think, it doesn't seem to me an easy extrapolation from what science can study about the origins of some of these human traits. It's not a sufficient explanation for me of what human beings are really like. Otherwise, you have to say all of these things that we hold very dear as what makes us uniquely human are some kind of evolutionary anomalies, like the horns of the Irish elk that grew ridiculously large and cumbersome and not particularly successful for that particular species. I just don't think you can ground complete understanding of humanness in any kind of a scientific explanation.
Hello, my name is Jacob. My question is for Dr. I'm sorry, I did not remember your name. Yes, you. Arav? When you were in your opening statement, you made a lot of statements about how far science has come in the past 400 years and how many discoveries have been made and how advanced we've become. And I would agree with that we've made so many discoveries. And you also, the way you presented your statement was that your belief system, your system of beliefs was grounded in science, in what you could, is that correct?
I would just generalize a little bit in evidence-based.
Evidence-based.
Evidence-based, yes.
And you also did make a statement, and I think everyone could agree, that science is constantly changing. We're constantly making new discoveries. We're constantly proving things wrong, proving things right. And to me, I would ask, how do you just justify your system of beliefs when they're rooted in something that is constantly changing, if that makes sense?
Yes. I would like to answer that with an anecdote of one of my the science fiction authors that I like most, and that is Asimov. Asimov wrote wonderful stories, and one of his best is a trilogy of the Foundations. And in that trilogy, he had basically built in the first book a whole religion of science that had its priests and basically made science to be a full religion. And one of the memorable quotes that he had there, he said that the difference between the science religion that he built and all other religions is that when you turn the switch, then light goes on in the room. Scientific, the religion of science, meaning works under basically any context. So while you're right that science is very famous for changing its point of views and for being able to adapt to new empirical evidence, I would say that we have a lot of basic stuff that is never going to change. For example, almost all religions believe that the earth is the center of the universe and that the sun goes around it. And science had disproved that and found the actual model, and it's not going to change. So while there are changes, there's also a methodical building of a vast amount of empirical knowledge, which is then transferred to everyone in society to tremendous benefit. Once we learn how to do something with medicine, we use that. If something better comes, we'll either augment or replace, but it's not that we are changing right and left, black and white, capricically. We're building a phenomenal foundation of knowledge about what the world is.
Thank you.
I would just like to agree with Nahum, absolutely, that we learn real, true things scientifically, and our religious attitudes have to adapt, and our way we interpret the scriptures or sacred texts adapt. So it's not just a problem of scientists, it's a problem of just being human and learning and understanding better the natural world and the supernatural world.
If I could just tag on. I also thought that was a great explanation, but I just wanted to say, I don't think that geocentrism is a primary tenet of Christianity, or that it's even taught. It's phenomenological language that people misconstrue, in my personal opinion.
I'd like to ask a similar question, but with slightly different. There seems to be a distinct difference between science and religions in the fact that scientific ideas, under science, all ideas, no matter what they are not subject to absolution. They're taken with the idea that given our knowledge as of this point in time, that this is the best way of explaining or understanding something. And that is a tentative belief of sorts, rather than an absolute one. And it seems that there's no counterpart to that in religion, that things are held as truth. Whereas in science, truth in the more literal sense doesn't actually exist. That things are
Do you have a question?
best guess.
Do you have a question?
I was asking, how do you reconcile the difference?
You want to direct that to someone? Maybe like the preferred.
Carlier?
Yeah, I'll come back to that. I think I think I understand your question. I think what you're asking at is in religion, you're sort of asking what is the ultimate fact. And the ultimate fact in religion is God, at least in my view. And at least in science, as if you were a metaphysical naturalist, if you believe that, or a philosophical naturalist, as John would say, the ultimate fact is the universe. And so I think that's also a strongly held belief and unprovable that the universe is all that there is. So I think there are competing faiths there. Is how I'm sure that will generate some discussion.
one of the things that I mentioned to my students is one of the most remarkable things about science, sort of historically, as a way of approaching the world, is that it is almost unique in all the ways that different cultures approach the world, where it does not demand a set body of truths that everything else is built around that cannot be challenged. It's a rather astonishing way of actually approaching the world, that we actually make discoveries and then propose ideas that we are willing to throw out. I mean, historically and sort of cross-culturally, this is an astonishing way of actually approaching the world. It's just that when it was invented by the ancient Greeks and adopted by, Western culture, it's proved to be remarkably successful, but it is somewhat counterintuitive. And I think it is one of the ways that makes science fundamentally different from sort of the religious view of the world, where religions really do have a set of doctrines and dogmas that it is difficult to have them be challenged and difficult to have to modify.
Difficult but not impossible.
And if I might interject a very small observation again with my theme, is I believe that a lot of people in our society are struggling mightily because they are expected from their upbringing and from their families and their surrounding to hold beliefs that are really ancient, to hold beliefs that were carved in stone more than 2,000 years ago, and to take it as dogmatic truth, while they see that the world around them does not behave that way. And that is a kind of existential struggle that I've seen in a lot of my students who come to my office hours, that they really want to have the scientific worldview, but they come from fundamentalist families and they struggle mightily. So in that case, the simple progress that science had gave to us, as my colleague just said, had really put into sharp focus this kind of dichotomy.
But just because something is ancient doesn't mean it's wrong. Because human beings have struggled with the same sorts of existential questions from the beginning of recorded history. It's only the science that's new. And of course people have to adapt to the science. I totally agree with that. But if you're going to ask a question about the problem of evil, maybe you want to go back and read the book of Job that was written 3,000 years ago. You might learn something.
I totally agree that ancient knowledge doesn't have to be true, but obviously it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be wrong, but obviously it doesn't have to be true. And my question about when we know the world around us, all of its geographical extent and human pluralism, there are at least 500 competing religious philosophies. Why should we take the book of Genesis of any more importance than the Quran or any of the Hindu texts or any of the thing that people believe in Japan? What makes our tribe knowledge any more true or correct than all the other tribes on the earth?
Quick response, you're left with a question there. So.
Quick response.
Very quick.
I just want to say I totally affirm your question. This is why we're in university. You got to look into this. For me, I've done my own personal study and I've come to my conclusion. But this is something that everyone has to do themselves.
I would also add that there are many similarities between the religions of the world because they're addressing common problems, and oftentimes we come up with very similar understandings of the human condition. But on the other hand, there are also huge differences between the different religions, and they can't all be true. And I think each individual has to study the issues for themselves and come to a decision about which narrative they're going to base their life on.
I just wondered if you could come up with a non-political solution to what seems to be a political problem where I live in dealing with college science professors and discussing with them issues of religion. What's happened is they complain to me that their students are coming into their biology classes without any knowledge of evolution. I didn't understand what was happening in the local public schools. And then I discovered that essentially that topic in the biology semester was being minimized, or if not eliminated, where I live. And so the freshman students were coming in without any knowledge of science. And so the professors had problems talking about issues of science and religion because the community environment was such, as it was. And given that the Supreme Court has made the teaching of creationism illegal, as well as intelligent design. What the state of West Virginia, where I live, what a lot of the teachers have done, they just said, okay, we will abide by that, but we also won't focus on evolutionary theory. And so it's created this community dynamic problem in terms of having a conversation. I just wondered if you could give any suggestions about how to deal with that.
Maybe an anthropological viewpoint on this one.
You know, it really gets to the heart of the problem of science and democracy. Because one thing about science is not very democratic. So if you do an experiment and you observe a result, there's not a lot of room for, disagreeing with that result. Whereas, in a democracy, and this has been a subject for the last really 200 years, as the science curriculum has become a political issue, and as science has become increasingly perceived as a challenge to theological views of the world that the state feels invested in and the public feels invested in, there is this tension between, in a democracy, we want local citizens to have a say in what their children are being exposed to, and yet corporations and the government and institutions that rely upon modern science for self-defense and for whatever reason, well, we need an educated public, that compromise is a difficult compromise. And asking for a solution from any four of us, that's a really tough one. Except I think John's got one. Discussion, civic discussion, is probably the best way to begin to address this question.
And also, Matthew, compromise is very difficult when issues are completely polarized, as we can see in our present House of Representatives and Senate. And in this issue of creation, science, and evolution, it has served the purposes of different constituencies to completely polarize the issue, that it's either or. Either you believe in creation or you believe in atheistic evolution. There's no middle ground. That makes it impossible, I think, to compromise at this point. I just hope people will grow up over the next couple of years and take the science and the religion seriously.
My question's for Dr. Oral. And in your discussion of religion, one of the chief objections I take it that you lodged was that religion tends to be geographically isolated. If you grow up in the East, you're going to tend to be Islamic. Buddhist, grow up in the West, you're going to tend to be Christianity. And so that state of affairs is taken to be an objection against the existence of an objective truth regarding religion. But my question then is, if you stretch out intellectual history in regards to science, and think of the history of ideas kind of spatially, if you grow up in a certain time period, you're less likely to believe in science. You grow up in the last 400 years, you're more likely to believe in science. So if such an idea, if there's such a spatial or temporal distribution of belief in science, how do you rescue that from the objection that you lodge against religion, and with that, with the strategy used to save kind of this belief in the truth of scientific inquiry? Why cannot that same strategy be used to work on behalf of religious questions?
Thanks for this excellent question. Here I can definitely, use my scientific tools of education. I believe that what you have here is a classical example of putting two different axes and comparing them. The temporal axis, the time axis, is what we call progress. And I will be shocked if I will come 300, 400, 500 years from now, and the world will be back to non-scientific Greek gods' beliefs, because I don't believe we can go back. I believe that that is a progress of accumulative knowledge and thoughts of humans. The problem that I see with the core and practice of religion in the world is because of its ancient tribal origins. You do have tremendous amount of tapestry of religious beliefs. And I remind you that religious beliefs have a lot, the vast majority of issues they deal with are non-scientific at all. And one of the things that you have is you talk with a Muslim and he tells you, that if you take Jesus Christ to be the actual God, then you can never go to heaven. If you ask the Christians, if you don't take Jesus Christ to be the God and Lord, you cannot go to heaven. That is kind of a totally diametrically opposite points of views. And again, I will challenge the audience, if you have more religious view, put yourself in Afghanistan as a little boy. Won't you be just as fundamentally zealot Christians, or let's say high faith Islamic in Afghanistan, as you are right now Christian in the US?
But Nahum, what about you? What if you had grown up in the hills of Afghanistan? What would you believe? What would you know about science?
It is very interesting. I think that if I would have been indoctrinated from very early age, I don't take any kind of objective sainthood, I don't know what I will do. Society pressure, family pressure, everything around me would have shaped a lot of my worldviews, and this is how I understand as an adult what happened with religions everywhere. That the vast majority of the reason people believe in one thing or another is because they were born to a family and society that believe in one way. And that, for me, is a big philosophical and spiritual problem.
Maybe that's true, but certainly in this, in a university in the West, it's not true at all. We have many options open to us, and we have to investigate them and make decisions for ourselves. I just take myself as an example. I grew up in a very conservative, dogmatic Christian environment, but I don't think that I inherited my Christianity. I believe that I seriously considered the alternatives, and I know many of my friends that I grew up with. Some of them left the Christian faith and went elsewhere. But we're human beings. We're not programmed by our environment. I don't think those of us who consider these issues seriously, we have the freedom to make up our mind and to make our own decisions.
Well, I fully agree with what you're saying. I believe that you will also agree with me that the influence we had in our formative years is shaping a lot of our worldview for the rest of our lives, even if we put a lot of thought into it.
Well, I'd like to thank my friend for stealing my question, so this is my backup question. For Professor Arav, is that correct? I'd like to offer a potential answer to your question and get your thoughts on that, because I'm not a scientist or a physicist, but it seems to me, from what I understand of science, that light is quantifiable, but darkness is really just the absence of light. And in the ancient world, that was not the perception. The perception was light and darkness were kind of a duality. But in Genesis 1, we don't have the creation of darkness. We have the creation of light. And darkness is really just the absence of light. So that seems to me to be evidence of something in the text, of something that contradicts the prevailing worldview that wouldn't have been natural, wouldn't have been a natural conclusion of theirs.
Well, I think this will definitely demand a long theological discussion, and there are lots of different points of views on that. I think the way you framed it, the problem that I see with that is that it is one, in hindsight, interpretation of what we have in the Bible. So it's problematic for me because I don't think that was the held view when the text was written. I don't think this was the common view of people during the Middle Ages, where they took the same exact book as what they believed in. And I can just give you a very, very small counterexample, which again will risk into getting into a lot of theological questions, and that is first chapter in Genesis. We have a very well constructed creation story that goes by days, but the sun was only created on the fourth day. So there was absolutely no meaning for the concept of day before the sun, because the sun is what giving us the illusion of the day. 24 hours are between sunrise and sunrise.
So again, I know that there are a lot of theologians that thought about it and different things, but there was no concept of a day until the fourth day. So how do we reconcile that with having the first 3 days? Just as a food of thought. I'm not opening it up for debate.
Can I just
Full disclosure, I too am a historian. I too teach the science and religion course that Matthew Goodwin teaches. I also teach the history of modern science. But I want to ask a question that comes from a past spring event at Virginia Tech. It seems that most springs we have had a creationist, more traditionally creationist presentation. Some years ago, Dr. Kent Hovine was here, gave a lecture, and basically defined science as what we can observe, measure, and test. And anything else is not science. It's metaphysics or it's religion. If you weren't there, if humans weren't there, it's not science. What that means is that the historical sciences are impossible. Evolution is impossible. Paleontology is impossible. Historical geology is impossible. The history of the universe is impossible as a science. I'm not asking you basically to attack Dr. Hovine here, but you must have had conversations like this with your students, and I'd be interested in any of you being able to comment on the conversations about these kinds of issues. There's no evidence out of history, which means there's no evidence out of a lot of theory in science. And so these are some of the issues that seem to face us. And the man from West Virginia, whom I think I know, Josh?
Yep.
Hi. We had a conversation about this before, but it's still the case that a huge fraction of the American population does not accept evolution. And so the issues that he's facing in West Virginia may not necessarily be faced in the biology classes here, although maybe Dr. Tyson can comment on that. But I'd like to hear about the conversations that you've had with students about what is science such that evolution can be a science, or paleontology, or the other historical sciences.
Anyone want to jump in on that one? A lot about history, so there's a prompt for Goodrum and Tyson. Either of you want
Well, I'll start. I define science as careful observation and controlled experiments and a body of theory that makes sense out of the data. And certainly evolutionary science conforms to that definition.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah. So if anybody asked me, that's what I would say. But actually, I don't have the students knocking on my door very often asking me that question. That would be my answer.
Let me give you a refreshing example that you can use, and that is, most people don't realize that astronomy and astrophysics is actually a historical science. Mm-hmm. And the reason is we see the universe as it was in the past. We can measure very clearly the distances of objects, and because we know that light travels in a constant, very high speed, but constant, we know that Andromeda Galaxy, what you look at it right now, is light that started 2.5 million years ago, where the early hominids were running amok in Africa, to be a little bit dramatic about it. So astronomy is a classical case where we have a total time machine, and we have very strong evidence that our observations are in total refutation with young Earth creationists, 6,000 years or 10,000 years, and it's not really disputable. We do see stuff that is millions and billion years old, and we use that for scientific inquiry. We actually can see the universe as it was young, and this is my research, and I see a universe that behaved very differently 10, 12 billion years ago because it was much more violent place, much more chaotic, much more order came out of that. But I actually see that. The universe 10 billion years ago was a different place than it is now, and we know exactly how it evolved. So, if that is of any help, then can you?
Yeah, that is helpful. Thank you.
And of course, in evolutionary biology, we have two time machines. We have the fossil record, and we have the record that's written in our DNA. Extremely powerful.
We're at our 7:30 cutoff limit, but I'd like to sneak in one more question if we could. Is that okay with everyone? Okay.
Yes, my question is directed more to the two theists. Both of you spoke of the compatibility of Christianity and some modern scientific theories, namely evolution and the Big Bang. And this question may come out of my own ignorance. I guess maybe that's why I have the question. But from my understanding, the Genesis account has a slightly different order than the Big Bang theory. For example, in the Genesis account, the earth was actually created before the sun, as you made reference to. And in the Big Bang theory, it seems more that the sun was created before the earth. So I just wondered what you thought.
Thanks for the question. And this is great because Nahum made a fantastic point. And I think this is one of the ways that we have to look at the Bible text as a Christian. This is what I feel. And try to understand the original intent of the author. So when you look at the Genesis 1 text and you see that the sun is created on day 4, you wonder, what did a day mean before that, right? So my personal view is that Genesis is not poetry. It's exalted prose with poetic elements. And I think the purpose of Genesis 1 is to really tell us about the fact that there was one God, and He's the creator. And there's amazing structure if you actually look at Genesis 1, and you'll see that in days 1 through 3, they're actually creating spaces. And for example, on day 1, He creates the heavens. And on the corresponding days 4 through 6, He fills that in. So I look at it as a poetic example of writing, or semi-poetic. And so I think the same analogy can be if you go into Genesis 2, there's an even more elaborate structure. I'm not a Hebrew. I studied Greek, I've never studied Hebrew. But I've read how there's an amazing 7-fold pattern in Genesis 2. There's a slightly different order described there as well. And I think it's not meant to be a scientific account of creation.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's not to be read historically or literally. It's a theological statement about a creator God who created things ex nihilo by His word. And the first thing He created was light. And how close can you come 3,000 years ago to describing the Big Bang? I don't know.
Okay, we are unfortunately out of time, so I'd like to have everyone thank our panelists and all the great questions. I would also like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. We know Ring Dance is going on, and my sympathies are with you getting out of here. If you would like to avoid the external traffic and you would like to continue discussion, we have the room, but not the microphones. We have the room for a little longer, so if you'd like to come up around the tables and leave, some of our panelists may be leaving, but I think we can carry on the conversation up here. Again, thank you. Thank everyone for participating. Thank our sponsors from last time, Free Thinkers of Virginia Tech for hosting, Crew for advertising, the Christian Scholars Network for advertising and monetary support, and the Tri-Cities Area Non-Theist Group also for advertising and monetary support. So again, thank you all for coming, and have a good weekend.